So this morning, as usual, I was sitting outside drinking coffee, and I turned on this video about philosophy and logic in particular. And like right out of the gate, this guy starts talking about like logic from a UK perspective, which some of you will appreciate is different from so-called continental philosophy. So the UK in the 1800s, 1900s, the UK brand of philosophy was very sterile and very mathematical. Like if you look at Bertrand Russell, who I don't have any patience for that guy. I think he was just worthless, and for me, and some of his colleagues. Very sterile, very mathematical, very formulaic, and just boring as shit, to be honest with you. So this guy starts talking about logic and how that became like the basis for computer science, and without logic. I mean, the guy goes from philosophy to logic to computer science, and I was just like, dude, you already lost me. Like, you're just too boring. And too stupid and too sterile and too impractical and too detached from life, right? So I mean, I've obviously thought about this here and there, but I've never like put it together like the way I put it together this morning after listening to this guy who just bored the bejesus out of me. So here's what I think logic is, and it's just the way I see it. Maybe I can add another component, but here's how it occurs to me right now. From a practical standpoint, this is what logic appears to be to me when I look at things and when I engage with like analysis of research, etc. What logic appears to be to me is number one, doing things correctly. And I realize that's vague, but I'll try to clarify in just a moment. So doing things correctly, number one, not making mistakes, which that's what engages the study of logical fallacies. So part of doing things right means not doing things wrong, not simply trying to do things right, or at least that's part of it, you know. So anyway, number one, doing things right, being logical, being sequential, putting things together, explaining things, whatever. So number one is doing things right. Number two is not doing things wrong. Number three is information. So part of doing things right and not doing things wrong also has to include an information base to support those actions. Excuse me. Because people who try to be logical without information, they're just bullshitters, you know. And that's the phrase from Henry Frankfurt. So that's an official phrase, you know, in philosophy. You can look at his work from Princeton. But you'll see a lot of people these days, they want to be right. Maybe they even have good intentions. They want to be right. And maybe they don't want to make mistakes. So maybe they've read a book on logical fallacies or whatever. But they don't have enough information in their heads to put a solid argument together. So number one, think logically and sequentially. I think I just added a fifth component. Number two, don't commit logical fallacies. Number three, you have to have information. The more information, the better. Otherwise, it's just going to become a bullshit Ponzi scheme. And number four, what I thought of earlier, is that it has to have some context. It has to have some social context. So, for example, like if you look at a lot of politics and medicine, and medical politics and political medicine, it may be somewhat accurate. It may not be fallacious, at least not obviously so. And maybe it's supported by whatever level of information. But the context and the consequences are intolerable. So without appropriate environmental, social, humanistic context, something can be right, non-fallacious, supported by whatever level of evidence within within a limited level of evidence. But if the ultimate consequence of that action is death and destruction and suffering and control, hegemony, then we would say that it's apparently logical, but ultimately impractical or harmful, and therefore doesn't meet the criteria that we should have for legitimate logic. So those were my four, and then as I was saying this, I came up with another one. So number one, logical, sequential, constructed in a solid manner. Number two, non-fallacious. So you have to review the work and make sure it doesn't contain logical fallacies. Number three, it all has to be backed by as much data, facts as possible. Number four, it has to have some teleologic value, humanistic value, contextual value within a culture and outside of that culture, if it's going to be extended, globally, like so many things are these days. And the fifth one that occurred to me right now, and maybe probably the other bases cover it, but I was going to say the fifth component of logic maybe could include some type of kind of emotional maturity on the part of whoever's devising the argument or the structure or the information, because if people don't have like personal clarity about themselves and resolution of their own issues and whatever, then they're going to insert their own trauma into whatever they're constructing, whether they know it or not, and they usually don't know it. So I don't know if I can even think of a good example of that. Well, actually, I think maybe it's quite obvious. If you look at the people right now who are directing global policy, they're psychopaths. I mean, they're schizophrenic, sick people. And that plays out in their global policies and their philanthropy, so-called philanthropy, which is just manipulation. So let's say that those are the five components of what, at least in my opinion, is logic. I mean, when I listened to this guy talking this morning, he goes from philosophy to logic to computer science. I'm like, dude, you're just too dry to be practical. So I'm just going to say it real quick. Construct a logical, sequential argument. Avoid fallacies. It's got to be backed by information. Otherwise, it's going to be a fragile structure of bullshit. Number four is it has to fit within a social, environmental, teleologic context. And number five, it needs to be constructed by a person or a group of people who have some level of emotional and social health. Because let's just say a brilliant argument constructed by a sociopath is probably going to have sociopathic constructs within it, whether obvious or not. So let's just say that it has those five components. All right, I'm going to go have breakfast. Thank you very much.